This video will show you all the steps required to make and sew a double fold binding onto a quilt. This is the most commonly used binding in traditional quilting. We will be using cross-grain binding that finishes at 1/4 inch wide, with mitered corners, and we will be hand sewing it to the back of the quilt. Double fold binding will provide your quilt with a beautiful, sturdy finish that will help your quilt last even longer through daily wear and tear. First, let's learn about the different grains of fabric. The length of the fabric running parallel to the selvage is called the lengthwise grain. Notice if you tug a little along the lengthwise grain, there is no give at all. Now look at the width of the fabric, meaning the direction that goes from selvage to selvage. This is called the cross grain. Tug a little, and you'll find that there is some give. This is the preferred direction for this type of binding because it stretches a little, but won't easily warp out of shape. Now you'll need to know how much binding to make. Measure the outside edges of your quilt top and add an additional 6 to 10 inches to that total. This is how much binding you'll make. Next, you'll prepare your fabric for cutting. Press your fabric to remove all wrinkles. Using your rotary cutter and ruler, cut off both selvages. The selvage should not be used in a quilt because it is a different quality of weave and it will shrink and wash differently from the rest of your fabric. It's okay that the other two edges are not perfectly aligned. It's more important that the selvages line up. This will give you nice straight cuts in the next steps and will help you avoid the V syndrome. Now, make a clean cut on one end. Use your ruler lines to be sure you are at a clean 90-degree angle from the selvage edge. This will be the side that you do all of your cutting from. Now you can cut 2-inch strips. Cut as many as you'll need to complete your entire binding. Now it's time to begin sewing. You need to sew all of your strips together to create one long continuous strip. Place 2 strips right sides together at a 45-degree angle. You might find it helpful to mark the line that you're going to sew. Pin these 2 pieces in place. Sew diagonally across both pieces. A trick to remember here is to always sew from the outside corner to the outside corner. Do not sew from the dreaded L position. Trim to 1/4 inch and press the seam open. Continue doing this until you have sewn all of the strips. Press the entire strip in half, wrong sides together. Prepare a pocket on one end of the binding. You'll begin the pocket now, but you don't actually use it until the end. Open one side of your folded binding. Using your ruler, cut a 45-degree angle on one end. Fold down this end approximately 1/2 inch. Press. Now you'll begin sewing the binding onto the quilt. Use either a 1/4 inch foot or a walking foot. Either way, you'll be making a consistent 1/4 inch wide seam. First, sew down your pocket. Open up the fold, and using the 45-degree folded end, lay the binding down with the pointed end of the binding against the edge. Sew through all of the layers along the edge for about 3 inches. Backstitch and cut your thread. Fold the binding back into place. Beginning approximately where you left off, sew a 1/4 inch seam through all of the layers. Do this all the way around the quilt, stopping at the corners to follow the instructions for mitered corners. How to make a mitered corner. As you approach each corner, Stop sewing exactly 1/4 inch from the edge and back tack a few stitches. Using your foot control, make the sewing machine move very slowly here so that you don't sew too far. It is helpful to mark the 1/4 inch line with a pin or chalk marker before you approach. Remove the project from the machine. Fold the binding back at a right angle. Fold the binding down, even with the edge of the next side of the quilt. This leaves the fold even with both sides of the quilt. Starting from the raw edge, begin sewing the new side with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Follow these steps for each corner. Once you have sewn the binding around the quilt and have only a few inches left, stop sewing. Lift the presser foot, clip the threads, then tuck the unfinished edge inside of the pocket you created at the beginning. If necessary, trim off any excess length to eliminate all unnecessary bulk. Go back to where you stopped sewing and finish sewing a 1/4 inch seam through all of the layers. Now for the handwork. This is great for when you're watching TV. Cut a piece of thread that is no longer than 18 inches. Any longer, and your thread will begin to knot and fray from the stress of moving through all of these layers. Begin with a knot that is hidden within the seam allowance. Turn the binding to the back and whip stitch the folded binding edge to the back of the quilt. Your stitches should fall right onto your stitching and will be invisible on the front. We are using a contrasting thread so that you can see our stitches, but you should use a color that matches the backing of the quilt. When you run out of thread, secure the end with a knot by looping the needle through the thread twice. Begin again with a fresh piece of thread. As you reach the mitered corners, fold the binding at a 45-degree angle until it fits snugly over the seam allowance. Take a few extra whip stitches on the corner to secure it. Here at Connecting Threads, we are making quilting affordable again. At only $5.96 per yard, you'll find our exclusive fabrics collections only on our website or in our catalog. Visit us at www.connectingthreads.com to find a huge supply of quilting books, tools, and batting, plus our exclusive high-quality thread and quilting fabric collections.